Part 2, 1937 to 1941. Chapter 8, The Brown Paper Parcel. Piero had been living at the Berghof for almost a year when the Fuehrer gave him a present. He was 8 years old by now and enjoying life at the top of the Obersalzberg. Even the strict daily routines that were set in place for him. Every morning he rose at 7 o'clock and ran outside to the storeroom to collect the bag of feed for the chickens, a mixture of grains and seeds, before pouring it into the trough for the birds' breakfast. Afterwards, he would make his way to the kitchen, where Emma would prepare a bowl of fruit and cereal for him before he took a quick cold bath. Ernst drove him to Berchtesgaden 5 mornings a week for school, and as he was the newest arrival and still spoke with a slight French accent, some of the children made fun of him, although the girl who sat next to him, Katerina, never did. "Don't let them bully you, Peter," she told them. "There's nothing I hate more than bullies. They're just cowards. That's all. You have to stand up to them whenever you can." "But they're everywhere," replied Piero, telling her about the Parisian bully who had called him La Petite, and about the way Hugo had treated him in the Durand sisters' orphanage. "So you just laugh at them," insisted Katerina. "You let their words fall off you like water." Piero waited a few moments before saying what was really on his mind. "Do you ever think," he asked curiously, "that it would be better to be a bully than to be bullied? At least that way no one could ever hurt you." Katerina turned to him in amazement. "No," she said definitively, shaking her head. "No, Peter, I never think that. Not for a moment." "No," he replied quickly, looking away. "No, neither do I." In the late afternoons, he was free to run around the mountain to his heart's content, and as the weather was usually good at that altitude, bright and crisp with the fresh aroma of pine needles in the air, there was rarely a day where he didn't spend time outdoors. He climbed trees and headed off into the forest, venturing far from the house before finding his way back again, using only his tracks, the sky and his knowledge of the landscape for guidance. He didn't think of Maman as much as he once had, although his father occasionally appeared in his dreams, always in uniform and usually with a rifle slung over his shoulder. He had also become less diligent in responding to Angel, who now signed all his letters to the Berghof using the symbol that Piero had suggested, the sign of the fox, instead of his name. As every day passed and he hadn't written, he felt guilty for letting his friend down. But when he read Ansel's letters and heard about the things that were going on in Paris, he found that he simply couldn't think of anything to say. The Fuehrer was not present on the Obersalzberg very often, but whenever he was due to arrive, there was a great deal of panic and a lot of work that needed to be done. Ute had disappeared one night without even saying goodbye and was replaced by Wilhelmina, a soft-headed girl who giggled constantly and would run into a different room whenever the master approached. Piero observed Hitler staring at her occasionally, and Emma, who had been cooking at the Berghof since 1924, thought she knew the reason why. "When I first came here, Peter," she told him over breakfast one morning, closing the door and keeping her voice low, "this house wasn't called the Berghof at all. No, the master came up with that name. Originally, it was called Haus Rachenfeld and was a holiday home for a couple from Hamburg, the Winters. When Herr Winter died, however, his widow began renting it out to holidaymakers. That was terrible for me, because every time someone new came, I had to find out what kind of food they liked and how they wanted it cooked. I remember when Herr Hitler first came to stay in 1928 with Angela and Geli." "Who?" asked Piero. "His sister and his niece. Angela once held the job that your aunt holds now. They came that summer, and Herr Hitler, he was Herr Hitler then, of course, not the Fuehrer, informed me that he didn't eat meat. I'd never heard of such a thing, and thought it was terribly odd. But over time, I learned how to cook the dishes he preferred, and thankfully, he didn't stop the rest of us eating what we liked." Almost on cue, Piero heard the sound of the chickens squawking in the backyard, as if they wished that the Fuehrer would impose his dietary standards on everyone. Angela was a tough woman, said Emma, sitting down and looking out of the window as she cast her mind back 9 years. She and the master argued all the time, and it always seemed to be about Geli, Angela's daughter. Was she my age? Asked Piero, picturing a young girl running around the mountain top every day like he did, which made him think that it might be a good idea to invite Katerina up there someday. No, much older, said Emma. Around 20, I think. She was very close to the master for a time. Too close, perhaps. How you mean? Emma hesitated for a moment and shook her head. It doesn't matter, she said. I shouldn't be talking about these things, especially not to you. But why not? Asked Piero, his interest growing now. Please, Emma, I promise I won't tell anyone. The cook sighed, and Piero could see that she desperately wanted to gossip. All right, she said finally, but if you breathe a word of what I'm about to tell you. I won't, he said quickly. The thing is, Peter, at this time, the master was already the leader of the National Socialist Party, which was gaining more and more seats in the Reichstag. He was building an army of supporters, and Geli enjoyed the attention he paid her. Until, that is, she grew bored of it. But if she was losing interest in him, the master still adored her, and followed her everywhere. And then she fell in love with Emil, the Fuhrer's driver at the time, and there was so much trouble over it. Poor Emil was dismissed from the master's service. He was lucky to escape with his life. Geli was inconsolable, and Angela was furious, but the Fuhrer wouldn't let her go. He insisted that Geli accompany him everywhere, and she, poor child, grew more and more withdrawn and unhappy. The reason I think the Fuhrer watches Mulamina so closely is because she reminds him of Geli. They have a similar appearance, a big round face, same dark eyes and dimpled cheeks, equally feather-brained. Really, Peter, the first day she arrived I thought I was seeing a ghost. Piero considered all this while Emma returned to her cooking. After washing up his bowl and spoon, however, and replacing them in the dresser, he turned to ask one last question. A ghost, he said. Why? What happened to her? Emma sighed and shook her head. She went to Munich, she said. He took her there. He refused to allow her out of his sight. And one day, when he left her alone in his apartment on the Prince Regent's Platz, she went into his bedroom, took a gun from his drawer, and shot herself through the heart. Eva Braun almost always accompanied the Fuhrer when he came to the Berghof, and Piero was under strict instructions to call her Fraulein at all times. She was a tall lady in her early 20s, with blonde hair and blue eyes, and always dressed very fashionably. Piero had never seen her wear the same clothes twice. You can clear all this stuff out, she once told Beatrix when she was departing from the Obersalzberg after a weekend stay, throwing open her wardrobes and running her hand over all the blouses and dresses that hung there. They're last season's fashions. The designers in Berlin have promised to send samples of their new collections directly. Shall I give them to the poor? Asked Beatrix, but Eva shook her head. It would be inappropriate, she said, for any German woman, wealthy or impoverished, to wear a dress that has previously touched my skin. To wear you can just throw them in the incinerator out back with all the other rubbish. They're no good to me now. Just let them burn, Beatrix. Eva did not pay very much attention to Piero, certainly nowhere near as much as the Fuhrer did, but occasionally, when she passed him in the corridor, she would tousle his hair or tickle him under the chin as if he were a spaniel and say things like, "Sweet little Peter," or "Aren't you angelic?" comments which embarrassed him. He didn't like being spoken down to, and knew that she remained uncertain whether he worked for them, was an unwelcome tenant, or simply a pet. On the afternoon when he received the Fuhrer's present, Piero was outside in the garden, not far from the main house, throwing a stick for Blondie, Hitler's German shepherd dog. "Peter," cried Beatrix, stepping outside and waving towards her nephew. "Peter, come here, please." "I'm playing," Piero shouted back, picking up the stick that Blondie had just retrieved for him and throwing it again. "Now, Peter," insisted Beatrix. and the boy groaned as he made his way towards her. "You and that dog," she said. "Whenever I need you, all I have to do is follow the sound of barking." "Blondie loves it up here," said Piero, grinning. "Do you think I should ask the Fuehrer whether he might leave her here all the time from now on instead of taking her to Berlin with him?" "I wouldn't if I was you," said Beatrix, shaking her head. "You know how attached he is to his dog." "I wouldn't if I were you," said Beatrix, shaking her head. "You know how attached he is to his dog." "But Blondie loves it on the mountain. And from what I've heard, when she's at party headquarters she's stuck inside meeting rooms and never gets out to play. You can see how excited she is whenever the car arrives and she jumps out." "Please don't ask him," said Beatrix. "We don't ask the Fuehrer for favours." "But it's not for me," insisted Piero. "It's for Blondie. The Fuehrer won't mind. I think if I said it to him—" "You've grown close, haven't you?" asked Beatrix, an anxious note creeping into her tone. "Me and Blondie?" "You and Herr Hitler." "Shouldn't you call him the Fuehrer?" asked Piero. "Of course, I meant that. But it's true, isn't it? You spend a lot of time with him when he's here." Piero thought about it, and his eyes opened wide when he realized why. "He reminds me of Papa," he told her. "The way he talks about Germany, about its destiny and its past, the pride he takes in his people. That's the way Papa used to talk too." "But he's not your Papa," said Beatrix. "No, he's not," admitted Piero. "He doesn't stay up all night drinking, after all. Instead, he spends his time working, for the good of others, for the future of the fatherland." Beatrix stared at him and shook her head before looking away, her eyes glancing towards the tip of the mountains, and Piero thought that she must have gotten a sudden chill, for, quite unexpectedly, she shivered and wrapped her arms around herself. "Anyway," he said, wondering whether he could go back to play with Blondie now, "did you need me for something?" "No," replied Beatrix. "He does." "The Fuehrer?" "Yes." "But you should have said!" Piero cried, rushing past her towards the house, filled with anxiety that he might be in trouble. "You know he should never be kept waiting." He made his way quickly down the hallway towards the master's office, almost colliding with Eva as she emerged from one of the side rooms. Her arms flew out and she grabbed him by the shoulders, her fingers digging in so deeply that he squirmed. "Peter," she snapped, "haven't I asked you not to run in the house?" "The Fuehrer wants to see me," said Piero quickly, struggling to release himself from her grasp. "Did he ask for you?" "Yes." "Very well," she said, glancing up at the clock on the wall. "But don't keep him too long, all right? Dinner will be served soon, and I want to play some new records for him before we eat tonight. Music always helps with his digestion." Piero skipped past her and knocked on the large oak door, waiting until a voice inside beckoned him to enter. Closing the door behind him, he marched directly to the desk, clicked his heels together as he had done 1,000 times over the last 12 months, and offered the one-arm salute that made him feel so important. "Heil Hitler!" he roared at the top of his voice. "Ah, there you are, Peter," said the Fuehrer, replacing the cap on his fountain pen and coming round the desk to look at him. "At last." "I am sorry, mein Fuehrer," said Piero. "I got delayed." "How so?" He hesitated for a moment. "Ah, someone was talking to me outside, that's all." "Someone? Who?" Piero opened his mouth, the words on the tip of his tongue, but he felt anxious about saying them. He didn't want to get his aunt into trouble. But then again, it was her fault, he told himself, for not delivering the message more quickly. "It doesn't matter," said Hitler after a moment. "You're here now. Sit down, please." Piero sat on the edge of the sofa perfectly straight, while the Fuehrer sat opposite him in an armchair. A scratching sound came from outside the door, and Hitler glanced towards it. "You can let her in," he said, and Piero jumped up and opened the door. Blondie trotted inside, looking around for her master and coming to lie at his feet with an exhausted yawn. "Good girl," he said, reaching down to pat her. "You were having fun outside?" he asked. "Yes, mein Fuehrer," said Piero. "What were you playing?" "Fetch, mein Fuehrer." "You're very good with her, Peter. I seem to be unable to train her. I can never discipline her, that's the problem. I'm far too soft-hearted. She's very intelligent, so it's not difficult, said Piero. She belongs to an intelligent breed, replied Hitler. Her mother was a smart dog too. Did you ever have a dog, Peter? Yes, mein Führer, said Piero. D'Artagnan. Hitler smiled. Of course, he said. One of Dumas's 3 musketeers. No, mein Führer, said Piero. No? No, mein Führer, he repeated. The 3 musketeers were Athos, Porthos, and Aramis. D'Artagnan was just, well, he was just one of their friends, although he had the same job. Hitler smiled. How do you know all this? He asked. My mother liked the book very much, he replied. She named him when he was a puppy. And what breed was he? I'm not sure, replied Piero, frowning. A little bit of everything, I think. The Führer made a disgusted face. I prefer pure breeds, he said. Do you know, he almost laughed at the absurdity of the idea, that one of the townspeople in Berchtesgaden once asked me whether I might allow his mongrel to sire pups from Blondie? His request was so audacious as it was repugnant. I would never allow a dog like Blondie to sully her bloodline by frolicking with such worthless creatures. Where is your dog now? Piero opened his mouth to tell the story of how D'Artagnan had gone to live with Madame Bronstein and Ansel after Maman's death, but remembered Beatrix and Ernst's warning that he should never mention his friend's name in the master's presence. He died, said Piero, looking at the floor and hoping the lie would not be obvious on his face. He hated the idea of the Führer catching him in an untruth and losing his trust in him. I adore dogs, continued Hitler, offering no condolences. My favourite was a little black and white Jack Russell who deserted from the English army during the war and came over to the German side. Piero glanced up at him with a sceptical expression on his face. The idea of a canine deserter seemed unlikely to him, but the Führer smiled and wagged his finger. You think I'm joking, Peter, but I assure you that I am not. My little Jack Russell, I called him Fuchs, or Little Fuchs, was a mascot for the English. They liked to keep small dogs in their trenches, you see, which was cruel of them. Some were used as messenger dogs, others as mortar detectors, for a dog can hear the sound of incoming shells much faster than a human can. Dogs have saved many a life in this way, just as they can smell chlorine or mustard gas and alert their masters. Anyway, Little Fuchs went running out into no man's land one night. This must have been, let me think, 1915, I suppose, and made his way safely through the artillery fire before leaping like an acrobat into the trench where I was stationed. Can you believe it? And from the moment he fell into my arms, he never left my side again. For the next 2 years, he was more loyal and steadfast than any human I have ever known. Piero tried to imagine the little dog charging across the terrain, dodging bullets, his paws slip-sliding on the blown-off limbs and ripped-out organs of the 2 armies. He had heard these stories before from his father, and the idea made him feel a little queasy inside. And what happened to him? He asked. The Führer's face grew dark. He was taken from me in a despicable act of thievery, he replied in a low voice. In August 1917, at a train station just outside Leipzig, a railway worker offered me 200 marks for Fuchs, and I said that I would never sell him, not for 1,000 times that amount. I returned to my seat. Fuchs, my little fox, was gone, stolen. The Führer breathed heavily through his nose, his lips curling, his voice rising in fury. It was 20 years later, but it was clear that he was still angered by the theft. Do you know what I would do if I ever caught up with the man who stole my little Fuchs? He asked. Piero shook his head, and the Führer leaned forward, indicating that the boy should lean forward too. When he did, he held out a upper hand and whispered into his ear. 3 sentences, all quite short and very precise. When he was finished, he sat back, and something resembling a smile crossed his face. Piero sat back too, but said nothing. He looked down at Blondie, who opened one eye and glanced upward without moving a muscle. As much as Piero liked spending time with the Fuehrer, who always made him feel so important, at this moment he wanted nothing more than to be outside again with Blondie, throwing a stick into the forest, running as fast as he could, for fun, for the stick, for his life. But enough of this, said the Fuehrer, patting the side of his armchair 3 times to signal that he wanted to change the subject. I have a present for you. Thank you, mein Fuehrer, said Piero, surprised. It's something that every boy your age should have. He pointed over the table next to his desk, where a brown paper parcel was sitting. Fetch that for me, Peter, will you? Blondie lifted her head at the word fetch, and the Fuehrer laughed, patting the dog's head and telling her to rest easy. Piero walked over and collected the package, which held something soft inside, and carried it carefully over with both hands before holding it out for the master. No, no, said Hitler. I already know what's inside. It's for you, Peter. Open it. I think you'll like what you find there. Piero's fingers started to undo the string that held the package together. It had been a long time since he had received a present, and it was rather exciting to get one now. This is very kind of you, he said. Just open it, replied the Fuehrer. The strings came loose, the brown paper parted, and Piero reached inside to remove what lay inside. Inside was a pair of black short trousers, a light brown shirt, some shoes, a dark blue tunic, a black neckerchief, and a soft brown cap. A patch featuring a white bolt of lightning against a black background was sewn into the left shirt sleeve. Piero stared at the package's contents with a mixture of anxiety and desire. He remembered the boys on the train wearing clothes similar to this, with different designs but equal authority. How they had bullied him, and how rotten Fuehrer Kotler had stolen his sandwiches. He wasn't sure that this was the type of person he wanted to be, but then again, those boys had been afraid of nothing, and were part of a gang, just like the musketeers themselves, he thought. Piero quite liked the idea of being afraid of nothing. He also liked the idea of belonging to something. These are very special clothes indeed, said the Fuehrer. You have heard of the Hitler Jugend, of course? Yes, said Piero. When I took the train to the Ober-Salzburg, I met some of them in the railway carriage. Then you know a little about them, replied Hitler. Our National Socialist Party is making great strides in advancing the cause of our country. It is my destiny to lead Germany to great things around the world, and these, I promise you, will come in time. But it is never too early to join the cause. I'm always impressed by how boys your age and a little older cleave to my side in support of our policies, and our determination to right the wrongs that have been done in the past. You know what I'm talking about, I presume? A little, said Piero. My father used to talk of such things. Good, said the Fuehrer. So we encourage our youth to join the party as soon as possible. We begin with the Deutsches Jungvolk. You're a little young, in truth, but I am making a special exception for you. In time, when you're older, you will become a member of the Hitler Jugend. There's a branch for girls too, the Bund Deutscher Mädel. For do not underestimate the importance of the women who will be the mothers of our future leaders. Put your uniform on, Peter. Let me see what you look like in it. Peter blinked and looked down at the set of clothes. Now, mein Fuehrer? Yes, why not? Go to your room and change. Come back here when you're fully dressed. Piero went upstairs to his bedroom, where he took off his shoes, trousers, shirt, and jumper, and replaced them with the clothes he had been given. They were a perfect fit. He put the shoes on last and clicked his heels together. They made a much more impressive sound than his own ever had. There was a mirror on the wall, and when he turned to look at his reflection, any anxiety that he might have felt immediately vanished. He had never felt so proud in all his life. He thought of Kurt Kotler again, and realized how wonderful it would be to have such authority, to be able to take what you wanted, when you wanted, from whomever you wanted, instead of having things taken from you. When he returned to the Fuhrer's study, he was wearing a broad grin on his face. Thank you, mein Fuehrer, he said. You are most welcome, replied Hitler. But remember, The boy who wears this uniform must obey our rules and seek nothing more from life than the advancement of our party and our country. That is why we are here, all of us, to make Germany great again. And now there is one more thing. He walked over to his desk and shuffled through some papers until he found a card with some words written upon it. Stand over here, he said, pointing towards the long Nazi banner that hung against one wall, a draping of red with the familiar white circle and hooked cross inscribed at its heart. Now take this card and read aloud what it says. Fuehrer stood where he was told and read the words slowly to himself first, before looking up at the Fuehrer nervously. He felt the most curious sensation inside. He wanted to speak the words aloud, and yet at the same time he did not want to say the words aloud. Peter, said Hitler quietly. Fuehrer cleared his throat and stood tall. In the presence of this blood banner, he began, which represents our Fuehrer, I swear to devote all my energies and my strength to the saviour of our country, Adolf Hitler. I am willing and ready to give up my life for him, so help me God. The Fuehrer smiled and nodded, took the card back as he did so. Fuehrer hoped he did not notice how his small hands were trembling. Well done, Peter, said Hitler. From now on, I don't want to see you wearing anything except this uniform. Do you understand? You will find 3 further sets in your wardrobe. Fuehrer nodded and gave the salute once more before leaving the office and making his way down the corridor, feeling more confident and grown up now that he was wearing a uniform. He was a member of the Deutsches Jungvolk now, he told himself, and not just any member either, an important one. For how many other boys had been given a uniform by Adolf Hitler himself? Papa would be so proud of me, he thought. Turning a corner, he saw Beatrix and the chauffeur Ernst standing in an alcove together, talking quietly. He only caught a little of their conversation. Not quite yet, Ernst was saying, but soon. If things get too far at hand, I promise that I will act. And you know what you'll do? Asked Beatrix. Yes, he replied. I've spoken to... He stopped talking the moment he saw the boy. Peter, he said. Look, cried Peter, extending his arms wide. Look at me. Beatrix said nothing for a moment, but finally forced a smile onto her face. You look wonderful, she said. A true patriot, a true German. Fuehrer grinned and turned to look at Ernst, who was not smiling. And there was me thinking you were French, Ernst said, touching the tip of his cap in Beatrix's direction, before stepping through the front door and disappearing into the bright afternoon sunshine, a shadow dissolving into the white and green landscape.